Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Dr. Turton. We saw the report from Karen. Is all our resources, water resources, our rivers, our dams, is it as dire as we saw in that insert?
You must remember that the Vaal River is the foundation of a substantial portion of our economy. Something like 60% of our national economy is sustained by the Vaal. So obviously it carries a higher pollution load. So it looks more dramatic, but certainly it is a very good indicator of what's happening in the rest of the country. In fact, some of the smaller municipalities have got even less capacity to manage it. So although the impact is smaller because the volumes are smaller, it is no less insignificant, for example, in the Eastern Cape, for example, in the Northern Cape, parts of KZN, etc.
Are we heading for an ecological disaster? Are we in denial of the severity of what's happening?
More than a decade ago, I went on the record as saying that we are facing a slow onset disaster. And the significance of a slow onset disaster is something that happens so slowly and so incrementally that you can't quite see that it has happened. We're now at a situation where we are seeing systemic failure, systemic collapse. So it's across the entire water sector, we're seeing collapse. We've seen the Department of Water and Sanitation having been hollowed out internally through corruption, through maladministration, unable to even make the decisions that are necessary, unable to mobilize the capital needed, and they failed dismally in their regulatory role, because what they should have done up to now is prevent the municipalities from going so far into debt. They've now gone into a situation where they are so deeply in debt that they are unable to pay their way out of the debt. So we're now seeing systemic failure, and this is going to simply accelerate until such time as we turn this thing around.
So the lack of that regulatory interventions, where has that now left us? Because we're talking about more than a decade.
Yes, we've left there. We've been in a decade of denial. So a lot of the energy has been spent on, for example, discrediting people like myself that want to get up and say that we have a problem. So it's no longer about discrediting. We've wasted so much energy now on focusing on the wrong thing. The simple reality is that we now have probably one of the biggest crises we have in our country, because the sewage crisis impacts on everything else. It impacts on human health. It now impacts on job creation. It impacts on our export capacity, because the EU is no longer going to be accepting our products. We're already seeing some of the major retail stores refusing to purchase leafy greens, for example, that have been grown under these conditions. So we're now facing, as I said, a systemic failure. The amount of money we need to turn this around is between 800 billion and R1 trillion. And of course, we now know that government simply doesn't have that money. So I was at a meeting yesterday with Save the Vaal, and they've got a very sophisticated strategy, and they've done probably a decade's worth of work on developing that strategy. And that's the kind of example of the parallel process that's now starting to unfold.
What has been the strategy thus far, though? What significant interventions have there been, even though it hadn't paid off from government side and the Department of Water and Sanitation in particular?
You see, okay, we get to the nub of the matter now. Firstly, I'm not a spokesperson on behalf of Save the Vaal. I don't want to speak on their behalf, but what they've done is quite significant, because they have laid the juristic foundation for legal transactions in this space, and they're about to do some very substantial things. So they've created the framework, but they haven't solved the problem, and that problem will probably take another decade to solve. So what is the actual problem? Well, there are different levels of problem. In my professional opinion, the fundamental problem, the absolute fundamental problem, is Chapter 3 of the Constitution, the Cooperative Governance Clause, is being falsely, in my opinion, interpreted by the former Minister of Water Affairs, Nomvula Mokonyane, when she said that one government department may not intervene in the affairs of another, and one sphere of government may not intervene in the spheres of another. Now, we're about to take this matter to the Constitutional Court to get final clarification on that, because it is a constitutional crisis as much as anything else. So the question now is, if the National Department of Water and Sanitation is unable to intervene in the affairs of others, well, then obviously you're going to have failure, because they've now allowed this thing to get out of hand. So we have to get a ruling on that matter. So you get the Save the Vaal action happening at one level. Our action is happening at another level now, at the Constitutional Court level. We're still getting our ducks in a row for that. And then there are going to be other legal actions coming out of that, because what I've noticed happening now is that in the failure of the political system and the failure of the technical system, everyone is now resorting over to the legal system. And the legal system is almost the last recourse to get the ship back on track.
But surely what we've seen is that this has a knock-on effect. You can't exclude other departments because we're talking about lives, that are at risk, livestock that we've seen, farms that are affected in this particular insert, the reference to the Vaal, and we see health. So how on earth do you operate and save the water resources if everybody's working in isolation?
Well, they are working in isolation, or they have all been doing their own little firefighting in their own area. But now you speak to something else, and I want to just, I'm a person that calls a spade a spade. We're dealing with a culture of impunity. So as soon as you try and deal with someone and hold someone accountable, no one is ever accountable. They get redeployed, transferred. This simply has to stop. So that's another part of what the action that the group that I'm involved in now. We are now going to start holding people accountable. And we're busy assembling our war chest for that. We're busy assembling our funds, our legal team, etc. But we will hold people accountable. No longer can they simply be redeployed. No longer can they simply pass the buck and say that Section 3 of the Constitution says we may not intervene. Because ultimately, if we don't do this, then we're going to see systemic failure across the whole country, and we're all going to be worse off. So I'm afraid we've got to show teeth now.
I'm going to pick up on some of the stuff you said in the second segment of this interview, but let's talk quickly then, if we talk about accountability. With whom does the buck stop?
Aha, good question. We don't quite know, so we have to determine that. So my question that I posed just recently in a Facebook article that I wrote was, firstly, I would like very much to work with the Minister of Water Affairs in Quinty. I really would love to have a good relationship with him. But within the very first week of him coming to office, the first decision that he makes, and he makes public, is that he knows that there's maladministration and corruption in his department, and he has decided to forgive those people and not to do anything about it. So my question is he now aiding and abetting the act of a criminal offence? Does he have the legal standing to make that decision? This is a matter that we will now be taking some legal advice on, and we will go for that because we are going to bring that buffalo down.
So let's talk about fish in water and what the strategies are after the break. Bly ingeskakel. Net hierna sit ons die gesprek voort. Moenie weggaan nie. Ons is nou net terug. Welkom terug by Fokus. Water is iets waarsonder niemand kan lewe en al hoe meer bekommer bestaan oor die waterbronne in Suid-Afrika. Ons gas vanaand is professor Anthony Turton. Hy is by die Vrystaatse Universiteit se Sentrum vir Omgewingsbestuur. Talk to me about the Sedibeng Regional Sewer Scheme and what was that meant to do?
Well, look, I don't know the exact details of all of these nitty-gritty things at municipal level, but you must remember that one thing that people do every day is they go to the toilet. You need to remember that. Irrespective of whether they're employed or not, they go to the toilet. So you can do what you want to, you can't stop the flow of sewage. And because of the way that many of the cities, for example, Welkom, Vereniging, these places are all built on flat land. And in order to get a fall in the sewer, you've got to go fairly deep, and you've also got to have pump stations. So I don't quite know how many pump stations there are in, for example, the Sedibeng area, but I would guess something in the order of 60, probably maybe more. And if one of those fails, then the whole thing fails. So we've got a very complicated engineering structure. We need to understand this, that when we open the tap or when we flush the toilet, it's not magic that happens. There's significant engineering behind all of that. And all of those things are failing now one by one by one. The pumps haven't been repaired. The electricity bills haven't been paid. There's a whole lot of institutional failures behind it.
So what have we actually accomplished with our national water resource strategy?
In my professional opinion, we've failed dismally because in 2002, National Water Resource Strategy 1 put on the table with a very high level of confidence a startling fact that no one really took notice of, in my view. A couple of scientists did, but they were not listened to. It said that we'd allocated 98% of our national water resource to a high assurance of supply. And no one said 98 is nearly 100. What happens when we hit 100? Subsequent to that, we've now found very high confidence scientific studies have shown that we overestimated the volume of water we had available for various technical reasons, climate change being one and the improvement of the mathematical models being another. The important thing is 98 is as close to 100 as you can get. We'd allocated up to 120% in some of the river basins. What we should have done in 2002 was recognize that we're now becoming a fundamentally water-constrained economy, and we should have then started saying we have to transition to a recycling economy where we start recovering water from waste and we start recycling our resources. We haven't done that. So we now, on the one hand, we've got this avalanche of sewage coming into the system, but on the other hand now, we have to start rapidly mobilizing capital and technology to come into the space to start recycling and making that safe again.
So when we're talking about recovery, we're talking about rehabilitation of a lot of our rivers and our dams, and we look at that situation that we saw on the Vaal, and it's across the country. We have those similar incidents. Where's the money going to come from? In particular, if so many of these municipalities are under administration, there's corruption for people that have not even been prosecuted. So how are we going to resolve this?
Well, we're talking systemic failure. So the system has failed. The system of local government, the house of cards is collapsing one by one by one. And unless we can turn that around quickly, all things being equal, we're probably not going to be able to. Therefore, we have to, it's incumbent upon leadership now to say that actually the Titanic is still floating, but we've hit an iceberg. So is it responsible to now say that we need
sewage in this
case? We need to go to the lifeboats or not? But we mustn't panic. That's the important thing. We mustn't panic. So I don't want to be a prophet of doom now. The important thing is that we are dealing with this crisis now, and we have to appoint committed people, technically competent people, and the bottom line is we're going to have to find a way of bringing in capital and technology into the water sector, because government simply is facing a fiscal cliff. The fiscal cliff is coming up very soon. Already it's been announced that 30,000 civil servants will be laid off. Yes. They will come into the market, into an economy that is not employing, and what's going to happen to them? So the fiscal cliff is a real thing that's coming towards us. Government is simply bankrupt. So we have to now think very carefully about rolling out PPPs, public-private partnerships, and I'm working with some of the top financial institutions in the country to start rolling out what they call a cookie-cutter solution to that problem, where they start looking at, for example, your sewage works. How can they actually solve the problem in one sewage works and then replicate that rapidly across the whole industry? Because there is enough capital around. There's a huge amount of money that's available, but private sector capital, and there is also a significant amount of technology. So the question from a policy perspective now, from a national government perspective, is how do they create the enabling platform for technology and capital to come to the fore? And that's the big question that we need.
So what are you telling taxpayers, in particular our viewers, who say, well, we need a turnaround. When I open my tap, I can't drink the water. I don't have water. We don't have access. And the water that we have access to is either murky or brown. We can't consume it. So are you asking them to just be a little bit more patient?
Well, I don't have any authority to ask anyone to do anything. I'm just simply an ordinary scientist doing my job and doing the best that I possibly can. But I'm trying to be a bit of a beacon of hope in the sense that I want to give people a sense that there is a better future. Because if we give in to despair, then of course that's the worst thing that we can possibly do. Yes, the Titanic has struck the iceberg, but it's still floating. We don't yet have bodies floating in the water. So we've got to focus now. We've got to be careful about it now. And it's not a question of if the water's dirty, that's one thing. It's the stuff you can't see in the water. And what people don't realize, that our water is contaminated in South Africa with a blue-green algae, a toxin called BMAA, beta-methylamino-L-alanine, BMAA, and I'll be talking a lot in the media in the near future about this. But BMAA is a toxin that's put out by a single-celled creature, a little blue-green algae, a primitive organism that's neither plant nor animal. And when it gets distressed, it's fed by sewage flows. It loves sewage. It multiplies. It proliferates rapidly. One becomes a million very quickly. But this, when it gets distressed by chlorine or by pumping or by any of these filtration processes, it gives a little molecule out. And that molecule is so small that no current filtration process can remove it. So this is a serious problem. This is not a spook story, scary before you go to bed kind of nightmare scenario. This is a very real scenario. And it's incumbent upon scientists with a moral conscience and engineers who understand the implications of this. They now have to start speaking up, because the few scientists that have been out there on their own, that have been the lightning rods for this, they cannot stand for very much longer. They've been struck by lightning too often. So we've got to build a broad-based consensus now of engineers, of solution seekers, and we've got to get away from the blame seeking and who knew what when. It's irrelevant.
Thank you so much for your vigilance, and thanks for telling us what the state of our water resources are, Dr. Turton.